AWS, Elastic, Kubernetes services, and IP addressing. Let's get into it. I have an EKS cluster provisioned already, and I also have a deployment. Let's go ahead and look at my current deployment. You can see that I have a deployment called metadata. And if we go ahead and we'll take a look at the pods, and we'll also include the pod IP and the node, you can see that the pod IP is 192.168.34.189. You'll see that right here. And we can also see that it's deployed onto this particular node. So we have a container in a pod. The pod resides on a node within my EKS cluster. And the question here is, how do we get that 192.168.34.189 IP address? So by default, EKS is going to use the AWS VPC CNI plugin, and it is going to assign a pod IP depending on the subnet on which the particular node where the pod lives, on which subnet that particular node resides. So if we switch over to the AWS console, I have two nodes in my EKS cluster, and you can also see at the bottom here of the screen, it's showing my VPC, and then I have 4 subnets within that VPC. And if I click on each subnet, I can see the CIDR range. So for example, this first one that I clicked on, it's going to have a range of 192.168.0019. Here's the second one, third one, fourth one. So again, the pod IP was 192.168.34.189. Let's go ahead and take this CIDR right here and plug that into the very handy CIDR.xyz site. And you can see that the first usable IP address in that range is right here. Here is the last usable one. So the pod IP, which ended in 34.189, is going to fall within this particular range. So what that tells us is that the node on which that pod resides is going to be associated with this particular subnet. You can also see that that subnet is within the US West 1C availability zone. And again, the reason why the pod was assigned that particular IP address, it has to do with the fact that it exists on a node that is associated with this subnet. If it were deployed onto a node that was associated with any of the other subnets, then the pod would get an IP address depending on the CIDR associated with that particular subnet. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about here as well is, if I were to expose this deployment as a service of various types, we have node port, load balancer, cluster IP, for example, and it's going to get a cluster IP. Where is that coming from? Well, that is also assigned by the AWS VPC CNI plugin. We can actually see that CIDR if we go to the EKS page and we look under networking. We can see down here the range that will be used. So it's 10.100.0.0.16. And if we switch over to my shell and we'll go ahead and we'll look at my current services, we can see here that I have exposed this deployment already right here, and you can see that there is the IP address, and again we can verify that it falls within that particular range that we just looked at in the AWS console. And here is the node port, so 32359. Lastly here, let's go ahead and verify that this actually works. If we switch back over and we look at my subnet, we can see that it was in the 1C availability zone. Looking at my two instances, this first instance here is the only one instance I have in that same availability zone. And if we look at the public IP address, 184.169.217.63, and we'll grab that, and then we also specify the node port that we're assigned, then we can see the page that was part of my deployment, and it's displaying some pod metadata. So to summarize, the pod is going to get an ephemeral IP address depending on the node and that node's subnet CIDR range. And then if I do expose it as a service, again, it's going to be the AWS VPC CNI plugin that will assign a service IP depending on the EKS configuration. We can go into the console and see the service IP CIDR range as well. And that is a bit about AWS, EKS, and IP addressing. If you have any other videos about Kubernetes that you would like for me to record, then please put that in the comments. Thank you.